Welcome back. Today I'm joined with Glen Fukushima. He's Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Welcome back.
Thanks.
I'd like to talk a little bit about influence that the Japanese wield in Washington, D.C., and influence that maybe the administration or that America exercises here in Tokyo, in Japan.
Yeah.
And it's a big deal. It's not very well, lobbyists, for example, there are lots of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. There are very few lobbyists here, and in fact, it has a bad connotation.
Right. Well, it's very interesting. When I was working at USTR back in the 80s, some Japanese businessmen friends of mine in Washington, D.C. told me that as soon as they arrived in Washington, they were inundated by American lawyers, lobbyists, and consultants who wanted to represent them. Right? By contrast, when American businesses would come to Japan in the 80s or 90s, when I was working here in the 90s, they said, we want to exercise some influence, in the Japanese diet or in the Japanese ministries, and where do we go for that?
Yeah.
Because most, as you well know, most Japanese companies have that internal in their own organization, so there hasn't been an external industry that provides that service. Now that's developed over the last 20 years, and I know you've been centrally involved in this, but in Washington, it is such a developed industry that, whether you're an American company or a foreign company, small company, large company, as long as you can pay the fees, you can hire people to represent you. And that is a huge difference between Washington and Tokyo. Now, as I understand, there are some developments in Japan that are very interesting, but I guess it shows that Japan is changing and that there is more openness, and I guess one of it is that it shows that there are more foreign companies that want to exercise influence, but also that the Japanese organizations like the Diet and the ministries are maybe more receptive than in the past to seeing people who aren't necessarily full-time employees of a company that are coming to represent their clients.
Right. In Washington, D.C., though, this industry, this lobby industry is very effective. It's usually, if you pay, you do receive some benefit for having paid that money. That's not always the case here in Japan, but in Washington, D.C., it's a very refined art.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting, too, is that the people in Washington, D.C. are very often former government officials or former members of Congress, whereas in Japan, I have run into some people like that, but not that many people who are former, Ministry of International Trade and Industry officials or former Diet members who are open to being, working on behalf of foreign clients.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the times, the trade organizations themselves are actually a kind of a lobbying arm. Whereas here in Japan, the people who are working in these trade organizations, they're industry specialists, but they're not really lobbyists. They really don't relish going and knocking on doors and talking to people. They like doing what they're doing for their members, but the lobbying part is not typically a central part of what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. But under you played such an important role in things like the Diet Doorknock in Japan and trying to make sure that the American business community connects with the Diet members. So that's very valuable.
That was a really interesting challenge because it had never been done before.
Right.
Were you president? You were on the board at that time.
I was, I think, vice president at the time.
Okay.
Yeah. But you had your experience on the Diet, so that was very helpful.
And it was a hard sell. We had to pitch it and we had to kind of show credentials and do a slow approach.
Right.
And since then, it's been, for the last 22 years, it's been an annual event.
So I think, as I recall, I may be wrong, but I think, it was as a result of the 93 change where Hosokawa became prime minister, and the first time in 38 years, there was a non-LDP prime minister, and that actually alerted the foreign business community to the notion that maybe it's not only the ministries, but it's also the Diet that we should be approaching. And that kind of set the background for the ACCJ. And I think Tom Jordan and you and I and a number of others felt we should really try to get some engagement with the politicians as well as the ministries.
Well, I remember we went to Washington, D.C. on the D.C. Doorknock and came back kind of with our tail between our legs because we just got beat up so much. We went there representing American business in Tokyo, but people treated us as if we were representing, Japanese interests, and defending Japan, and you should do it this way and not that way. And, with Mickey Cantor as USTR, it was not a very friendly environment. And so following up on that, I remember when we came back to Tokyo, we needed to figure out what can we do. This is a really bad environment, and we're going to suffer as a result of that.
Right. Well, I think we've all matured over the years, and so I think the chamber here and American companies have become much more sophisticated over the last 20 or so years in trying to exercise influence. I think in Washington D.C., I think my observation is that although there are these American organizations that kind of have a business of lobbying, on behalf of companies, whether they're foreign companies or American companies. Japan itself, in terms of its own presence in Washington, is not as much as it used to be. Back in the 80s, when Japan was such a powerful economic powerhouse, at that time, I think the Japanese government had a lot of financial resources, and there was so much attention on Japan. Even if the Japanese didn't want to draw attention to themselves, they just attracted a lot of attention because their companies were doing so well, and the economy was really growing. But now, when I went back to Washington this time in 2012, I felt, boy, the presence of Japan had really dropped, especially compared to places like South Korea or China or India and other places in Asia. But I think, thanks to Prime Minister Abe, he has, I think, recognized the importance of trying to enhance Japan's presence in Washington. So I think the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Ministry, and others have devoted some resources, financial and personnel, in order to have more Japan-related activities in Washington, like conferences, seminars, symposiums, and so forth. So there's a lot more Japan-related activity now in Washington than there was, say, in 2012.
Right. Japan chairs as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Getting into the universities, facilitating more kind of budding Japan hands to focus on Japan earlier in their career.
Right.
One of the other things that I'd like your input on is developing people who can facilitate influence. Not quite lobbyists, but like lobbyists. Here in Japan, as you know, law firms who in Washington, D.C. on K Street, lots of law firms they have a lobbying arm as well. Whereas here in Japan, very, very rarely do law firms engage in lobbying activities, but a few of them are starting to practice that. But the real key element here is finding people to do that. And even if you might pull somebody out who's been a former minister of state or even a member of the Diet or even a staff member of the Diet, doesn't mean that they can produce product or actually turn influence into something that's marketable for a client that says, I need you to help me get my product off the warehouse.
Yeah. Well, one thought is, if there are people who used to work in the Japanese government or Japanese Diet, it might actually be interesting to send them to Washington kind of for a training program to, see firsthand how it's done in the United States and see if some of those skills can be translated into the Japanese context.
There's a lot of tactics and skill and just know-how, but the most critical thing is having a network, because without a network, people will be polite to you, they'll have a meeting with you, they'll listen to you politely, but nothing happens, and the next time you have a call, they're busy. Right.
No, I think one of the things that's often said, obviously, about the U.S. and Japan is that human relationships are so important in Japan, and I'm sure it's the case in government relations as well, that in the United States, in fact, I was talking to a person, should mention the person's name, but this person was working in Washington, D.C. for 4 years, and then just recently came here representing a certain major country, not the United States. And this person was telling me that in Washington, what this person would do is to give cold calls to people that the person saw in the newspapers or on TV who are kind of influential on foreign policy issues or industrial issues, and just cold call them at various trade associations or at think tanks and meet with them and get to know them and create a network. Whereas in Japan, this woman said that it is so difficult in Japan because it's hard to kind of cold call somebody and expect that person is going to immediately meet with you and develop a relationship in a short period of time.
Sure. I mean, things take a long time here. You've been doing it for a long time. I've been doing it for a long time. And there's still lots of things to learn every day as you're trying to develop those relationships. And, exercising influence isn't about getting something for yourself. It's actually, probably more giving something, facilitating something so that at some point in the relationship, you can come back and say, by the way, could I ask you a favor?
Sure. And I suppose, language is always an issue because, it's possible to do business in Japan without Japanese, but it makes it harder.
Yes.
So, to be able to speak Japanese well enough so that you can actually gain the trust and confidence of Japanese who don't speak English is another barrier that needs to be overcome.
There is a budding industry that's going on here in Japan for kind of like lobbyists. We don't use lobbyists because it's kind of a dirty word,
Right.
but people who do public policy analysis and facilitation of public policy issues.
Right. Okay.
And it used to be maybe 15 years ago that if you were doing that, because you've been doing that for a long time, in addition to wearing your hat as a CEO or whatever it was that you were doing inside the company or inside the American Chamber of Commerce, it didn't support a role for an individual or a team of individuals. And over time, over the last 5 years or so, that has changed with the big Fortune 100 companies coming into Japan. And they might have a single-headed person for legal or for HR.
Right.
Now they have a single-headed person for public affairs as well.
That's great.
And that industry is really starting to grow, mostly with young Japanese who have spent time in one of the ministries or have been a diet secretary. But it's really starting to bubble up.
That's very encouraging.
Yes. It wouldn't have happened, 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. Sure.
And when we ran the Diet Doorknock 22 years ago, nobody was really familiar with knocking on doors or making a presentation to Japanese policymakers in English or in Japanese. There was a lot of fear, and the restrictions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act also, made people think twice about doing anything or making a move that might be misinterpreted either by their bosses in the United States or by the Japanese recipients too.
Right. Actually, my work, the one point you touched on just now, very important, that often I had to work hard to persuade headquarters that it was important to do some lobbying in Japan, because sometimes the guys back in headquarters in the United States or in Europe would think everything should be a commercial matter. I mean, why do you need to talk to some, a political person? Why do you need to go to a ministry? Why, isn't it a business transaction?
Right.
Well, it is a business transaction, but often in Japan, it can involve extra business factors.
Sure. Well, not only that, but it's nice to be invited to go to dinner or to go to a party, but reciprocity is also involved in that. I mean, the expectation is, yes, we're going to invite you and you don't know very much, but come along and we'll teach you. But at some point in time, you need to return that favor. And that means that if you're not going to pay for it out of your pocket, the company as the beneficiary should pay for that. And then you run into the restrictions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Right.
A lot of fun in trying to facilitate public policy in Japan. We're going to continue to follow up on this. You should too. Please stay tuned.